Well, good morning, Brett, and any of our two listeners who happen to be tuning into this. It's Doug Hewlett and Brett Atterbury with the Sheepdog Brotherhood.
Our
Welcome
parents
back
and our
for
friends.
what is this now? The fourth episode.
I think so. Aren't you in
Wow,
charge of keeping count?
Brett, you know where I went to school. Keeping count is a challenge for me.
Yeah,
Even
I wasn't
though,
going to mention
look,
that, but now that you
once
brought
I
it up,
once I get past these, we're hosed, man. So, how have you been this week?
very good. Had a busy week at work, so I was very happy for the weekend to roll around. Got a lot of rest this weekend.
Good
How
for you.
about you?
Yeah, we're finally about to begin our new endeavor in earnest this week. So it's just finally trying to get everything teed up and ready and organized for what we've got going this week. So
Cool.
looking forward to actually having a employment. Full time employment is very you know it's not overrated. The idea of being able to pay my bills, very exciting.
Yeah, yeah. What a concept. Congratulations on that. That's cool.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So, um, let's see. How do we want to roll into today's topic?
We're going to talk about the Bible, Doug. People are like, "Oh no, you're kidding me." Um, there's a, based on our Sheepdog Brotherhood, John Paul II statement, um, God has assigned as a duty to every man the dignity of every woman.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about that a lot during the week, kind of carry it with me. And when I come across something that I think is related to that, I kind of like to go, this might be interesting to talk about. So it wasn't this past week when I did this, it's been a while back. But when I was reading the Bible, which is something you should do, Doug, you should really think about doing that more often. I was reading the Bible and Ephesians 5 came up, and Ephesians 5:25 through 30 specifically. And when we hear this spoken at Mass, at least in the Catholic Church, if you're Catholic, um, it's always one of those that's kind of like, I think the men are out there listening to this and go, oh, how am I doing? So let me read that, and then I thought we'd talk about it a little bit.
Sure.
So this is from the most excellent Word on Fire Bible, put out by Word on Fire. So here we go. This is Ephesians 5:25 through 30. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, in order to make her holy by cleansing her with the washing of water by the word, so as to present the church to himself in splendor, without a spot or wrinkle or anything of the kind. Yes, so that she may be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hates his own body, but he nourishes and tenderly cares for it, just as Christ does for the church, because we are members of his body. This is a call to be completely sacrificial and to completely give oneself over to one's wife. And yes, in Ephesians 5, there's other passages there that challenge the wife to do the same for the husband. But since we speak specifically about men, I thought about this, and it seems obvious that we should be doing this for our wives, for those of us who are married. But then I thought, why would we not extend this beyond just our spouses? Why are we not women within our circle of influence, be that our mothers, our daughters, our sisters, our colleagues at work, people in the church, women in the church?
Mm-hmm.
Why would we not extend that same kind of sacrificial love? In other words, completely giving ourselves over to them so that they could become everything that God meant them to be. And then speaking specifically about the Sheepdog Brotherhood, where we talk about standing in the breach for those men who do not do that, towards the women in their lives, why would we not also extend that even out beyond our circle of influence and work to think about women that we don't even know? Let's just call it women in general. Why would we not kind of take on that same kind of attitude, that same kind of commitment to sacrifice and give ourselves over to those women in terms of, again, empowering them? And then if you start to extend that to what if, and I know we talk a lot about what ifs here, but what if all men were doing that? Can you imagine from the bottom up in terms of transforming our culture, the impact that that would have? So that was something on my mind today. What do you think, Doug?
Let me ask you this, right? I'm not a smart man, and I need a lot of hand holding to guide me through things. So
Here we
what is
go.
that?
Here we go again.
What is how is that actionable? How do you put that into practice? Not just for your wife, right? That's a lot easier to understand. Like, all right, I'm going to love my wife. I'm going to do these things that I know she'll appreciate. I'm going to do things that will make her life easier. I'm going to put myself or my own needs or my own desires and wants secondary to hers, etc. Okay, how do I do that for, like you're saying, other people's wives, your coworkers, your nieces, and what are your thoughts on that? How do you make that actionable?
Yeah, the first thing, and this is a habit that I have, but every morning when I get up, I pray. I think you do that as well. First thing of the day, morning offering. So what about certainly the people, the women who are in your life, in your circle of influence, praying that God will guide them and protect them. But I have a specific prayer for the women in my circle of influence, and that is that please help them grow in virtue and holiness. So just starting the day with that act, I think, is really something that's key, because in the end, it's God who's in control of everything. So imagine if we're constantly every day praying for those women in our lives. God, please guide them, help them be more virtuous, help them be more holy, and how that also kind of sets up your own heart if you're constantly making that kind of prayer. Then, as you start to think about what do I do specifically, to your point about actionable things, I think sometimes that's kind of hard to do. It's like, well, I don't know exactly what to do for my wife or my significant other today or my women colleagues at work. But I think if you have in your mind and your heart that you want to do something and then ask God to help you with that, occasionally those ideas are going to come to mind, either while you're in prayer or sometimes if you're just there interacting with those women and it's on your heart and mind. And I think too, Doug, it's just a disposition that you try to form in your heart as a habit, because since we're all broken, we're naturally going to be self-centered most of the time. But if you're constantly doing that and thinking about it and asking God to help you with that, then those ideas and those thoughts about what you could do can come to mind, I think. And it also is just going to depend on, are you talking about your daughter? How old is she? In terms of how you can empower her. Your wife, like what is she doing in her life? Your mother, your sisters, the women in your life. If you're at work, your colleagues. It's just a bit different depending on that. But I think most important to me, Doug, is to make it a constant part of my mindset and my life. So this is not something that I think of once in a blue moon. It's something I think of daily.
How have you, let me say, how have you not matured in your attitude and view of this, but how have you, look, at one point you were 18. At one point you were 16 and had a much different view of women, I'm sure. How, not just because you're older, but Can you walk me through how you had this transformation?
Oh boy, you want my life story?
No, because that's boring. Look at you. I can tell you're a boring man. No,
All right.
just how have obviously things have happened in your life
Yeah.
that you now recognize that, man, like most men, we are all off the mark.
Yeah.
As well as we think we're doing, we're probably not. It's like my daughter and I watch the Three Stooges, and like so often, right? Like in an episode of the Three Stooges, someone will tell them to go do a thing, and then they go do a thing in the completely wrong place, right? That's part of the
Mm,
joke.
mm,
And I feel like that's me all the time, like I'm trying to do the right thing, but I'm doing it in completely like the wrong environment or the wrong place, and I miss the mark. So
mm.
how have was there a precipitating event that caused you to adopt this new way of trying to love people um, in a better way?
Yeah. I guess I would like to explain that. I have to dive a bit into my past, going
Okay.
way back, if that's okay, Doug. Is that all right? I
So
have
be
your
it.
permission.
So be it.
So be it. So, probably a place to start is, I became Christian 20 years ago. So, this coming April 10th will be my 20-year anniversary, so to speak, of coming into the Catholic Church at the Easter
Mind you,
Vigil.
April 10th is our anniversary
Is it really?
of not only our first date, but 1 year later, our actual wedding anniversary. Yeah.
What?
Yep.
There's got to be some. What year was that? What year did you get married?
We got married in 2010.
2010, yeah.
And so our
So this,
first date was April 10th, 2009.
that's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Anyway,
for me, it
continue.
was, go ahead.
No, no, I was like, continue. Yeah, tell your story. April 10th.
Yeah,
And it's my dad's birthday also.
gosh,
He'll be 90 this year.
that's amazing. That's so
Yeah.
cool. So April 10th, 2004, come into the church. And I was one of those, Doug. I think when people come into the church, there's all different kinds and all different motivations for coming in. Mine was, I was just on fire. And that's a whole nother story about why. But I came into the church and I had basically come from a background of um, nothing really. I mean, I wasn't an atheist, but I think I believed in God, but more kind of like this, spiritual whatever thing. Didn't really have like a kind of this firm grasp on, well, what is God to you and what does that mean? And so here I am. And so I'm really throwing myself into the teachings of the Catholic Church, which is just amazing, the history of the Catholic. And then also I run into the church's teaching on life.
Hmm.
And so I start to learn about that. And I'd already, Doug, just made the decision that I'm going to accept the church's teachings, the whole thing. I'd already heard about the term cafeteria Catholic of, picking and choosing what you want to believe and kind of rejecting the other stuff based on your conscience, or more likely based on, I just don't want to do those things because it's hard.
Hmm.
So I'd already made the decision I'm going to accept the teachings, the whole shebang. So here's this teaching on life, and I'm throwing myself into that. I'm learning about it. I'm accepting it. It makes sense to me. But it also caused a bit of discomfort in my heart and soul because 20 years prior to that, almost exactly 20 years prior to that, when I was just a teenager, so you were talking about teenage years, um, my girlfriend at that time became pregnant, and together we agreed, and she had an abortion.
Hmm.
So, being a completely unformed teenager in terms of virtue, uh, I remember, there's always a bit of a risk of going back to your 18-year-old self and thinking about that. But I do remember that it had little impact on me. It wasn't that I didn't know what abortion was. I knew what was happening, but I just didn't care that much, I guess is the way I would say it. And so, because all I knew at the time when we made that decision, and I remember this very clearly, was I had a feeling of great relief that my plans for my college education, my plans for my career that I was already thinking about, none of those were going to be interrupted by this surprise, so to speak. So clearly, I had not one thought in my mind at all about the well-being of my girlfriend, and certainly not about the well-being of our child.
Mm-hmm.
So here I am, 20 years later, coming into the church, learning about this, reflecting back and looking back on that experience. And now that I'm in the church and I'm really starting to focus on trying to become holier, trying to become more virtuous, even trying to understand what those things mean, this thing in the past is still there. And this took me, Doug, it took years actually to kind of come around for me about this. But I started probably about 6 years after I came to the church. I started going to the March for Life in Washington, D.C., because I lived up in Philadelphia at the time. And it just kept kind of taking me back to those teenage days. And what I couldn't reconcile, Doug, is that I completely accepted that I'd been forgiven by God for that. And yet there was something continuing to grow in my heart about, there's just something not right about what happened back then. I could never quite figure out what it was. And then I guess it had been it had been 9 years. So 9 years after I'd come into the church. So you could see how I was grappling with this for quite some time. And instead of, as time passing, it got easier and easier and easier to deal with, it kind of went the other direction. It just got harder and harder and harder to deal with, to the point that it kind of reached a crisis in my heart. And I knew this wasn't a big fancy word, concupiscence. I knew this just wasn't like, maybe this is so terrible, God can't forgive it or anything like that. It wasn't that at all. It was just something there. And then as the Holy Spirit would have it, I was driving home from work one day, and listening to Catholic radio. And there was a radio commercial for an abortion healing retreat, which is called Rachel's Vineyard. And this was, I remember it was just like, I got to see if I should be there. So somehow I remember the number that they said on the radio commercial. I run upstairs, I talk to the retreat director, Evelyn, and I remember asking her, I kind of told her my story. And I said, "Do you think this would help this retreat?" She goes, "Yes." And then I said, "Do you take men?" Because I didn't know. Maybe it was just a retreat just for women. And she goes, "Absolutely." She said, "You'll be in the minority, but yeah, you should definitely come and see if this can help." So there, 2 weeks later, I was there. And for me, Doug, this gets back to our responsibility as men. So I'll tell you a couple of things that happened. On the first, it's a 3-day retreat, if I recall. And on the first night, they show the retreatants a film, a true story about a woman, and I may get the details slightly wrong here, but it goes something like this. A woman who had lived a very loose life when she was younger, a lot of going to bars, sleeping with different men, and just, really not seeking virtue and holiness at all. And out of that way of living, had gotten pregnant 4 times, I believe, by 4 different men and had 4 abortions. And then it wasn't like something suddenly hit her out of the blue and she changed her way of living. She was still doing the same thing. She was at a bar, and a great, nice man was interested in her and came up to her. And she was probably expecting the same kind of thing that she had done in the past with men, basically using her, and frankly, her using them. But this guy was different. And he was interested in her, and they started talking, and then they went out on dates, and he treated her as a lady with respect. And out of that, they ended up getting married. They're having their own children. I think they had 3 or 4 children. And this is where the story got really interesting. She's up getting ready to go to bed one night, and she suddenly feels the urge to go downstairs and start writing personal letters to each one of her 4 children that she had aborted back, some time before. And what really hit me, and this is where things started to change for me, is she didn't just write some generic, letter to my aborted child. She actually named each one of them. She gave each one of them a name. I don't remember the names at all.
Mhm.
But it hit me right then that was the issue that I was having. Was I never, which seems strange to me now, but I never personalized this. I never thought that, oh, that's, back in my girlfriend and my experience, that's our child and he has a name and he is a person and his name is.
Mhm.
And that's when things at this retreat really started to turn around for me. So I already had in mind, after that experience, a name that's been kind of prominent in my family, my grandfather's name, and then my great grandfather's name. And it's a biblical name. I didn't know that at the time, but Jesse was a name that we had. And that was kind of rolling around in my mind. The second thing that happened, which was incredible, was I think it was on the second day of the retreat. And it's what I call everybody has to share their story time, their abortion story. So this is a very, they bring in priests, they bring in therapists, psychological therapists for this session because it is pretty intense. And so I didn't go first, but so we knew we were going around the circle and I knew my turn was coming. And Doug, just the way I think about things, I'm not just going to randomly wing it. I'm kind of planning in my head, like what I'm going to say and all these things, which by the way, I don't remember what I was planning, but all I do know is when it became my turn, everything that came out of my mouth was nothing that I was planning to say at all. And so this to me was when the Holy Spirit was really in my heart and showing me what the real issue was for me.
Mhm.
And so all these things I were planning out were kind of these logical kind of things. And frankly, just an unwillingness, a lack of courage to admit what the real issue was. And that's what came out of me. And the real issue was that I was deeply, deeply ashamed of not having had the courage to stand up for my girlfriend, to stand up for our child, and basically do what a man should do in order to defend them, in order to support them, in order to lift them up. And instead, just ran the other direction. So remember now, when I go to this retreat, at that time I was married, I had 3 children. I knew what it was like to be a provider, a protector. And all I could think about was I had completely and utterly failed in that duty when I was just a young man. And I know some people say, yeah, Brett, you were just a teenager. And I understand that. At the same time, I would say, well, I was old enough to father a child. So just the fact that I was a teenager, I don't think is a good excuse.
Hey, look, I mean, we send teenagers, they can enlist, they can go off to war. You
Yeah.
know, you
Yeah.
you were, I don't know the age, but right, you were probably no different in age,
Yeah.
and that's a pretty significant choice to make. And you were at that same age. So, good luck trying to make that excuse, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So we're old enough at the age of 18 to know what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. It wasn't like, while it may be true that I was not formed or I was not brought up in a religious household, I was brought up in a household that my parents were very strict about right and wrong, right? And so I knew enough, put it that way. And so really no excuses. And so uh, coming out of that retreat, just to kind of put a bow on that, is my final, I would call it morning because it was like 3 a.m. Every retreatant gets to spend 1 hour, this is a Catholic thing, in alone with the Blessed Sacrament. And I took that hour, and what I did is I wrote a letter to my child, Jesse. First of all, just, of course, asking for forgiveness, and then just, some other things. I still, of course, have that letter, treasure it. And then as my time was wrapping up, I just felt the urge to drop to my knees and just look at Jesus. And I simply just asked him, like, look, it's like, which was true at the time. I was like, Lord, I don't know anything about pro-life, like nothing. I've been to the march, but I don't know like how it works. If there would be any kind of thing that I could do in pro-life that would be useful, not a clue. But you've blessed me with talents. You've blessed me with a lot of experience in business, especially in marketing. And if there's some place for me in this thing, you know, I would really be honored if you would use me so that I could somehow help young women and young men not make that same mistake that, my girlfriend and I had made 20, I guess at that time would have been 20 years earlier, 20 years prior or more, 30. So lo and behold, the Lord works through broken instruments. I guess that prayer was heard. And like a year later, I was at Heroic Media. So pretty incredible story, but it's always there in my heart and what drives me. And one of the things I think that was kind of foundational as you and I were discussing this, the Sheepdog Brotherhood, is that men, even from a very young age, can start to form themselves in such a way and be formed in such a way that we don't look at women as objects, not things to be used for our pleasure in any way, but are each woman is a very precious daughter of God that deserves to be respected, honored, and empowered. And men have such an enormously important role in that. And as we look across our culture, it's obviously clear that men fall down in that regard all the time, not just with the issue of unexpected pregnancies, but across the board and many other things. And really, that's what we're doing here. We're talking about what is that thing and how can we, as men, become better, get better together, talking about this, challenging each other, iron sharpens iron. How can we go forward and be just better men at this?
Thank you for sharing all that. I mean, that I know you've told that story before, right? So it's not like this is the first time and like, holy cow, but that's incredibly personal, and I appreciate the fact that you're willing to share that. And I think anybody who listens to this who maybe stumbles upon it, will to be able to hear your story and realize that there's probably a lot of people out there who've been in a similar situation and
Yeah.
maybe still having that lingering pain, discomfort, whatever, whatever word you use to describe it, and
Mm.
knowing that someone, found their way through the situation and came out on the other side and is better for it. Hopefully this helps someone.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you sharing that story.
Well, you're welcome. It's you're right. I've told the story many times, but I find that when I do, it's like, the Holy Spirit just works in such incredible ways, and so I never want to stop telling that story. And I have to, depending on the time and the audience, include certain things, leave certain things out. Um, but every time I tell that story, Doug, it's like something new kind of appears, or I tell it from a different angle. It's always the same facts, but there's something there. And the way I do it, Doug, is I'm just trusting that that's just God just guiding it a certain way, because someone or someone's out there, that whatever I say, it's what their heart needs to hear, and God knows that. And so, yeah, I would just kind of ultimately, I would say this particular issue is really tough for men if they've had this in their background, because of the reasons I just went through. The shame can be deep once a man turns his life around and decides to seek virtue and holiness with all his heart. It can be such a deep shame that I've seen some men struggle with accepting that God could even forgive them for such a thing. And by the way, many women experience that same depth of despair over having done something like this. But my plea to such men, and women too, actually, is just to let God heal you. It's like, and understand that to God, you are the most precious human being, man, woman, um, beyond what you could even imagine. And he knows, obviously, he knows what you did, and he loves you. So make that the core, make that the first understanding. It's what I have over here, the prodigal son. There's a reason why I have that there. It's because if you remember the prodigal son, what an idiot he was, right? I mean, couldn't be like, couldn't be worse. And yet, what happens? The father, he, the prodigal son is never out of the father's mind, never out of the father's heart. And as soon as the prodigal son makes even one turn back towards the father, what does the father do? He doesn't say, okay, this is conditional. Come in, you got to make. He just runs towards the son, right? The son starts trying to, make amends and plea and all this. And the father more or less is like, dude, shut up. I just love you. Let's go. I'm so happy you're back. So if you can keep that in mind, that even in the midst of all of us doing incredibly stupid things that we do sometimes when we sin, the Father is always there. As long as we turn back to him in love, he's always there waiting for us. So I would just say, if you're a man who has had this issue in your past and it causes you angst, I get it. But just remember how much God loves you. So he's waiting for you, and you can turn this around. And if you're willing, start to tell your story. If you and I'd be willing to talk to any man who's struggling but wants to do that, because it changes hearts and it changes minds. There are very few men who step up and will tell this kind of story because of the shame involved. But if you do it,
You
it really changes people.
you brought up something that I made me. I want to ask this question. So we're living in a time where people, believe that if they think it, therefore it's true, right? So there could be plenty of men out there who don't have faith, who they acknowledge, something, but maybe perhaps they themselves don't believe in God the way that you and I try to. And I could see a situation where you have young men who are experiencing the same level of pain and difficulty, but can't put a finger on what the origin of that discomfort and pain and sorrow is. Mm-hmm. Because society tells them, and Planned Parenthood tells them, that, well, it's not a baby, it's not a human, it's a clump of cells. So on one hand, they've helped a girlfriend get an abortion. They have this pain that they're struggling with, this, something doesn't feel right. But because they're being told this by society and they feel this, they are not putting the two things together and go, the discomfort and pain and how I feel that doesn't feel right. They don't associate it with this, and they can't resolve that problem. And how do we fix that? How do we get people to stop thinking, right? As you're telling that story, let's imagine for a moment that someone who, is not pro-life is watching this and they just listened to your story and they're like, well, that's stupid. Why would I write a letter to a thing that's not a baby? I love when they're like, it's a fetus. We'll ignore the fact of what fetus actually translates to. But, they've been told that it's a clump of cells, that it's not a person. How do we fix that? How do we get people to understand that pain is probably, not probably, that pain is coming from the fact that, you've ended the life of your child. And in fact, it is a child that would have, had a name. I mean, there's plenty of people that find out they're pregnant and name their baby. Like a lot of times, like our daughter had a name before she was, popped out. We knew what we were going to call her. Anyway, so that's my question. Like, we're at a point in society where people just believe whatever nonsense they want to believe. It's like if I go camping in the woods and I don't know what poison ivy is, and truth be told, I still can't identify it even when I see it. But or I just didn't want to believe that poison ivy was a thing. And then I go home and I'm all itchy and I have a rash from poison ivy. Just because I don't believe in poison ivy doesn't mean that it's not poison ivy. Sorry.
Yeah. So, Doug, I have great hope in this area, and I'll tell you why. And I know we discussed this on a previous episode, but in the work that I do at Heroic Media, here's what we see happen often. And that is that, let's go back to your example of, or your thought about how society sees it. So what we initially will see in the work that we do is a woman, she will call and she'll say something like, within the first 30 seconds, she's going to say something like, I want an abortion. Okay. And then, not getting into it right here, but there's a process that we talk with her about, which is simply trying to understand her situation, like what's going on. And what we've seen over the years is many times as we engage a woman in conversation, and all that we're doing is making sure that she understands facts. And what are those facts? Medical facts about what an abortion is, not told in a manipulative way to try to like scare her, out of a decision or something, but just really like the same way a scientist would talk about it, right? Here's what it is, here's what happens. And then presenting her the facts, the medical facts about what happens when a woman carries a pregnancy to term? Like, what does that look like? Again, just kind of giving it scientifically. And then here's the key part. As part of that visit, then after presenting the facts about, what it looks like to carry a pregnancy to term, telling the woman the support that is available to her should she decide to carry her pregnancy to term. The emotional support, the financial support, the coaching, the mentoring, all those things that go with it. So now it's easy to remember. Roughly half of women who called in saying, I want an abortion, once you present her with those things in a very non-manipulative way, you don't need to try to force her one direction or another. Just tell her the facts and what's available to her. Doug, about half of those women will change their minds and choose life. So why do I bring that up? Because it gives me great hope, because what it says is that women already know, first of all, what's going on inside of them. You mentioned the clump of cells thing. I would say that these days, the vast majority of women don't believe that anymore, and they know exactly what's going on inside of them. If they didn't, then they just learned about it on the call that they're on. And so think about that. Just by being told, just by being informed about actual facts, about what it is medically and what's available to them, and very key, what's available to them in terms of support, they change their minds and choose life. So to me, this is the key. It's like for men who are men, especially, the Sheepdog Brotherhood, working to empower women in their lives, and the effect that has hopefully spreading out from other people, is simply that letting women know that people are there for them, especially men, standing in the breach, who are there to help them when other men have failed to do so. To me, that is the linchpin. That is the key to all this, because research that came out supported exactly what I just talked about, that we've experienced at Heroic Media, is even more optimistic. Research came out and said, and these are women, by the way, who had abortions. And they're basically asked, to put it in business terms, what is their customer satisfaction with the product that they purchased, abortion? 4 out of 10 were very satisfied. So I would say, to your point, Doug, these are people we would say that are just heart of heart. I mean, they're not well formed. They don't regret anything. They simply just kind of did their thing and went on with life. But 6 out of 10 who had abortions said that they would have preferred to carry their pregnancy to term. And then you ask, well, what would it have taken? And it gets back to that same thing: emotional support and financial support. And think about the role that men play in that, especially the father of the child. Again, I'll go back to my story, which I shared, completely abandoned my girlfriend on both of those points, right? So a woman feeling completely abandoned in that situation is obviously scared. And when scared, even when knowing what abortion is and what it entails, will still make that decision because the fear is so deep. Yet, if she has emotional support, certainly from the father of the child, but others in her immediate circle of influence, as well as knowing that she will have enough financial support to get her to a certain point, 6 out of 10 women who are thinking about abortion will change their minds and choose life. This is what we can do. This is a solvable problem. We just have to inform these women and then be there for them in terms of support.
And I think that's our call to action, right? What we want to do with the Sheepdog Brotherhood is certainly as it stands for the financial support, that if we can
Mm.
begin to amass a group of men that instead of, you remember that Sally Struthers commercial for the price of a cup of coffee every day,
Yeah.
we joke about it, we laugh about those ads, but similarly, right, if we can amass a group of men who find it in their hearts to make not a donation, but to pay money to help us solve this problem in small ways where we can take those proceeds and solve those problems, solve those specific problems that go to saving a life, helping a woman not only choose life, but help her to avoid a tremendous amount of sorrow, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
as a father of a child, um, you know what it's like. You see your child hurting, you don't want them to hurt. You would do anything to prevent them from hurting.
Mm.
If we had the ability to help a woman who's in crisis, who's fearful, who's scared, who isn't being supported, who may not have the financial resources to choose life in her mind, imagine if we amass our monies every
Mm.
month and we can go not only save that life but also help that woman avoid that sorrow and that pain.
Mm.
That's our call to action. So
Yeah, I think so,
we're still
Doug. And
working on putting those things together and
yeah.
having, but it's our goal here with this Sheepdog Brotherhood.
Yeah, and there are organizations, I think I mentioned one earlier, that do that kind of work. So, especially, people who are trained on that emotional support side, which is really important. That people who are trained to know what to say, what not to say, how to walk with a woman 1, 2, 3 years after she has her child, to empower that woman and train that woman so that she can become self-sufficient, independent, strong. Because I think, Doug, what happens is there's like a there's an effect we should be thinking about. So I'll dream big. Imagine that. Let's just say there's roughly 1 million abortions a year in this country. I think it's a little less than that, but it's in that range, and that's easy to remember. If 6 out of 10 of those women weren't doing that, that's 600,000 women a year who are making a decision for life, and everything that accrues to them, those women themselves, in terms of their virtue and holiness by making that hard decision, and the maturity that comes along with raising a child. Now I know there's the adoption option, but most women who carry their pregnancies to term do decide to actually raise their children. And how that just the act of raising a child forms you in virtue, because it forces you to give up a lot of your own self-centeredness and selfishness. It
Mm-hmm.
forces you to completely pour yourself out for the life of another, your child. Now think about if it was 600,000 women a year, and then the effect that has on people that they know, just this massive kind of network effect. And this is what we talk about, changing the culture from the bottom up, right? Instead of the way that much of pro-life has been geared toward trying to change it top down, using laws that restrict abortion, things like that, which another whole episode clearly doesn't work, or doesn't work as well as people would hope. And so for me, I have through the Sheepdog Brotherhood, through other types of initiatives that really work on um, getting that emotional and financial support to women, and there are great organizations that do both. I think that's the long-term way to do it. And think about, for we ourselves as men, as we engage in that and become better at it and learn from it, how it also forms us in virtue and character, helps us on our path to become more virtuous and holy.
Man, thank you. That's probably a great stopping point, you think, for
Yeah.
today?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Thanks for taking time out of your day to sit down and chat with me. And if I'm not mistaken, next week we're going to have a guest with us. Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Cool. Thanks, Seth.
Have a great day.
Bye.